Thank you all for being here. Thanks for the panelists for joining us. Um, this session, what you just heard for the keynote at lunch, and you heard Diamond's name mentioned more than a couple times. Diamond led the Black Voices Working Group in it was 2020, wasn't it? 2020, 2021, and the first recommendation of that working group was name and acknowledge how local news coverage and media institutions have negatively impacted Black Colorado communities. And that was the top recommendation. So this is a panel where we're going to explore what does that look like for newsrooms to do that? Why is it important to publicly address a history of racism, build trust, and how does it factor into moving forward alongside historically underserved and misrepresented communities? So we'll be hearing about some project in Colorado that is just going to be doing that, and getting some inspiration from some partners in the elsewhere in the U.S. or some leaders in the U.S. That are doing that as well. So with that, I'm going to just hand it over to Diamond to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Melissa. My name is Diamond Hardiman. Like Melissa shared, my pronouns are she and hers, and I work with Free Press and Media 2070, which is a media reparations project. And so I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have some on Zoom and some here in person, so just bear with us if there's any technology issues. But first I want to announce DeNeen Brown. DeNeen Brown is an associate professor at the University of Maryland, and she's an award-winning writer for the Washington Post for more than 35 years. She's a professor at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism, where she teaches feature writing and the power of writing voice. She's written about the country's history of racial terror, lynchings, and massacres. And after her 2018 story on the Tulsa Race Massacre, it was published on the front page of the Washington Post, and the mayor of Tulsa announced that he would reopen the city's search for mass graves of victims of the massacre. Over more than 3 decades, Brown has been a groundbreaking reporter with a strong writing voice uncovering stories about the Black community. She's also listed as a filmmaker and producer of Tulsa, The Fire and the Forgotten, which was released on PBS on May 31st of 2021. So welcome, DeNeen. We're so happy to have you. This is her on Zoom. And then next we have Ariella Cohen from the Philadelphia Inquirer. She's a deputy editor of the More Perfect Union series. Ariella Cohen, whose pronouns are she and her, is an award-winning journalist with a record of producing local reporting that makes a difference. Which, before joining the Inquirer, she worked as a reporter in Brooklyn and New Orleans, and she helped lead 2 nonprofit news organizations and worked as an editor for NPR's WHYY affiliate in Philly. Everyone say hi to Ariella. And then coming to the folks in the room, we have Kristen Fiore with us. Kristen Fiore's pronouns are they and them, and they are a West Metro editor at Colorado Community Media. They manage the Clear Creek Current, Canyon Courier, Golden Transcript, Arvada Press, and Jeffco Transcript. Kristen graduated from the University of Central Florida in 2017 and recently moved to Colorado after working as a senior entertainment reporter and an editor at the Village's Daily Sun. Welcome. And then last but not least, we have Alfonzo Porter with the Denver Urban Spectrum, who is the editor-in-chief with them. Alfonzo Porter, whose pronouns are he and him, is a journalist and an educator. Currently, he is the editor-in-chief, like I said, of the Denver Urban Spectrum, a 35-year-old award-winning publication targeting communities of color. He is the director of student media, as well as a journalism professor at Metropolitan State University of Denver. He is also the publisher of Blizzy Magazine, a monthly publication targeting the African American cannabis consumer. A 1987 graduate of MSU Denver, he has worked as a journalist for various publications throughout his career, including the Washington Post. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. So Melissa shared a little bit at the beginning about the first recommendation, and I know a lot of you were here for the session about the Black Voices and the Other Voices reports and the recommendations that came along with them. But I wanted to share a little bit about the background on the one that we're going to be focusing on today. So Tia spoke about it really well, but this first recommendation about naming and acknowledging how local news coverage and media institutions have negatively impacted Black Coloradan communities made it to our list of recommendations because it was really a priority and something that surfaced a lot in our working group conversations. We talked about the mistrust or the lack of trust between Black communities and news media. So when we got together in our groups, we had to leave space for that. And we really had to leave time and opportunity for people to process and think about and talk about all the ways that media has impacted their lives, impacted their communities, and leave space for us to grieve that, to be angry about that, to talk about how it's made us upset and frustrated. And so when we made the recommendations in the report, we said, let's make that the first thing that we say. Let's hold the truth and see where we're at and really think about where these relationships are and why they are that way. And really looking at the history so that when we move forward, we're moving forward with that reality in mind of where we really are standing in relationship to one another. So with that in mind, we're going to talk to folks about their projects that are looking at histories of news and institutions and media in various locales. And so if all the panelists, starting with Kristen, could talk about the projects that they're working on and why they started working on those projects, that would be great.
So I'm hoping to provide sort of a unique perspective to this panel because the Golden Transcript is a small local weekly newspaper, and we are still in the thick of this project. I have a small team of reporters and freelance researchers working on this project with me, and we've identified areas that we need to report on. Initial reporting concludes at the end of this week, and then after that, Golden Transcript reporter Cohen and me will be putting it all together and writing it. This project came about because CCM publisher Linda Shapley was at a Denver Press Club event, and there was a presentation by Jamaica Lewis, who is a librarian at Blair Caldwell. She was doing a presentation on the Black Panther newspaper, and in her presentation, she also showed traditional media coverage of the Black Panther Party in the area from the 60s and 70s. A number of the articles covering the Black Panther Party in a negative light were bylined by the Golden Transcript. Most of these were wire stories, but they were still what the editor at the time chose to publish, so they were what people were reading in Golden. At that point, Linda was only 2 months into her publisher role at CCM, but she felt discomfort seeing one of our own newspapers on the screen. She had also seen the Black Working Group's call to action for acknowledging harm. So those two things came together, and that led us to think that this project would be worth pursuing. We want to do this project because at 155 years old, the Golden Transcript is one of the oldest running newspapers in Colorado. All of the Golden Transcript's archive issues are available online, which can't be said for a lot of other newspapers. What the Golden Transcript published is a good representation of what a lot of small Denver and mountain area newspapers were publishing at the time, and we hope that this project will show why it's important for small town newspapers to hold themselves and their communities accountable. This is a big undertaking for us. I have a very small group working on this project with me. We don't have the resources that a bigger newspaper would have, and we're all doing this on top of our normal workloads. But we see this as an opportunity for us to demonstrate how the articles published by small newspapers contributed to systemic racism that still affects people today. Golden is a town of about 20,000, but the things that happened there can ripple out and affect anybody. So this is a way for us to be transparent and open the conversation to the community and within our own coverage area. It's also been a way for us to examine our coverage now and what we can be doing better today. So the bottom line is that we want to acknowledge harm, improve our coverage, and strengthen our relationship as a newspaper with the community.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alfonzo Porter with the Denver Urban Spectrum. And as it relates to a specific project, I think our very existence speaks to the notion that we endeavor to reflect images and perspectives from an African American idea that we do not find essentially in the mainstream media. So it is really very much of a balancing act to kind of provide a different skew, because over the years, obviously, the mainstream media has done quite a hatchet job on our community with the reflections and images that have been promulgated over these many decades. And so the creation of the Denver Urban Spectrum in 1987, for me specifically, coming out of journalism school at that time in 1987, I heard about this new publication being created, and I was very, very excited as a journalism major. And I don't think it was called the Denver Urban Spectrum at the time. I think it was the Denver Journal, if I'm not mistaken. And I was one of the first reporters for this new publication way back then. And then after having a career, and I moved back to the area in 2014 and ran into B in Colorado Springs at the CPA convention. We engaged in a conversation, and I said, well, you know, I was your first reporter. And she said, yeah, okay, whatever. And so, of course, being the vigilant journalist she is, she went all the way back to the first issue and found some pieces that I produced for the journal, now Denver Spectrum. And so I think what we do in the community is extremely essential. There is obviously a huge need for more publications like the Denver Urban Spectrum around the country. Obviously, as newsrooms began to diversify in their own minds, you know, they began to vacuum all of the great talent out of publications like ours. And so, you know, so those publications, those small urban publications, those rural publications that covered our community to provide a juxtaposition against the mainstream media's reflections, essentially went out of business. And so now I think that this particular conversation is extremely important as we look at how we can mitigate and repair the damage that has been done to our communities across the country over these years.
Thank you. Thank you. Ariella, would you like to share a little bit about your work with the Philadelphia Inquirer?
Sure. Well, first, I just want to say hello, and I really believe in local news, and so I'm so glad that you guys have invited me here today, and it's really fascinating to learn about the work that you're doing in Golden to reconcile your history. And so, More Perfect Union is also a project about historical record and reconciliation and understanding the role that the media has played in perpetuating racism in America. So the project grew out of an idea from a journalist named Erin Haynes, who lives in Philadelphia. She works for the 19th, which is another news organization, but you know, had recognized in Philadelphia how we have this really unique history. As you know, the city likes to call itself the birthplace of democracy. We were obviously the nation's first capital, and many of the nation's founding institutions started in Philadelphia first, from the first prison in the country, the first medical school in the country. We were the first planned city in America, and the list goes on and on. And so the question that she asked is, what can we learn about America's structural racism from Philadelphia? And set out to chart how racism implanted in these institutions that began in Philadelphia, and what the legacy has been. So looking at the history of these institutions and also present day harm. And so my role as deputy editor has been working with a small group of reporters to write and produce multimedia stories about these institutions. And they've all been a little different, you know. So some of them have been more straightforward, and some of them have been more complicated and sort of conceptual. We're working right now on one about urban planning, based off the fact that Philadelphia is the first planned city, just looking at systems like water and streets, and how these infrastructure systems perpetuate racism and how they're embedded and what that history looks like. For instance, the first water system that was created in America, in Philadelphia, the first city water system, was explicitly designed to cool our European bodies. The architect was very concerned that the European settlers were not equipped to deal with the heat of America, and so wanted to design a system for white bodies. And then, that was explicit in the 1800s. Of course, it became not explicit over time, but the infrastructure had been built in particular ways to perpetuate that racism. And so those are the kinds of questions that we're looking at.
Thank you, thank you. And we'll probably come back to this a little bit later, but if I'm not mistaken, the first in that series was also about news media in Philly and journalism. So we'll definitely talk about, go for it.
So that we did a story looking at the Inquirer's history, which was quite an education. It was the first story that I edited for the Inquirer. So I came in, right, and learned kind of all about the dirty laundry. And that, I think, came as a real shock to the institution. No one in the institution read it before it was published. I was even a freelancer at that time. Like, they hired me as a freelancer to edit it on a contract basis, and then I ended up coming on a staff basis. But a reporter named Wesley Lowry, who's based in DC, and who's a fantastic journalist, wrote it. And it really just looked at how the Inquirer from the beginning was a white newsroom in a Black city, and how that disenfranchised citizens, and also kind of the harm done to reporters over time who felt that they weren't represented and who weren't treated well. And so that was a hard story for the institution, and an important one for the city and the community. And then we also did one about news media, about TV media, because Philadelphia launched the action news format. A lot of TV stations use it, sort of like action news, we're on the scene, local news. The first station that did that was in Philadelphia, and then the news producer who created the format went on to New York. It ended up becoming, a nationwide format. But we looked at how that format was produced to be, cheap and include lots and lots of segments, and crime coverage was basically the way to do that. And so how urban communities kind of became inscribed on the public imagination as these very dangerous, crime-ridden places, because these reporters were just filing as many stories as possible, as quickly as possible, about the most sensational news as possible. And so that was also, I think, an important story to tell about news.
Thank you, thank you. And then DeNeen, if you could tell us a little bit about the Printing Hate project. I don't think it was necessarily covered as much in your bio. We talked about the Washington Post, but if you could explain a little bit about that project and working with the university on that.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here again. Thank you for the invitation to speak about this project, Printing Hate. The project was inspired by the ancestors, I have to say, by the Black people, Black Americans who were killed in lynchings and massacres throughout US history. It was inspired by my reporting on the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 for the Washington Post. For the people in the room or the listeners may know that Tulsa Race Massacre was one of the worst single incidents of racist terror committed against Black Americans in US history, and it was all sparked by a headline that ran in the Tulsa Tribune on May 30th, 1921. That headline said, "Mad Negro for attacking girl in an elevator." It was a front page headline that sparked the massacre. What historians say is that headline was like a whistle call to the Klan that was gathering in Tulsa around that time. And if you know this history, after the headline ran in the newspaper that afternoon, a white mob started gathering at the courthouse in downtown Tulsa, demanding the release of a Black teenager whose name was Dick Rowland, demanding that the sheriff release him so that he could be lynched. Now, lynching, you must know, was very real in our country, very real at this time. There were Black veterans who were living in Greenwood, which was an all-Black neighborhood in North Tulsa, one of the most prosperous communities in the country at the time. The Black veterans heard that the white mob was at the courthouse demanding the release of the Black teenager. The veterans marched to the courthouse, confronted the mob, and a shot went off. And as a result, the white mob marched on Greenwood, the Black neighborhood in Tulsa. As many as 300 Black people were killed in that massacre. More than 500 were injured. More than 1,200 houses and businesses in Greenwood were destroyed in that massacre. Now, I just want you to remember it all started with a headline that ran in the Tulsa Tribune. So during the summer of 2020, when we were all watching the anti-racism protests that poured in the streets of America and in streets of cities and countries throughout the world after George Floyd was killed, I remember we had a faculty meeting to talk about what was happening. And I remember thinking at the time that the media, just as many of your panelists have spoken about, plays a very important role in shaping the public's thought process. And it also historically has dehumanized Black Americans to the extent that they might be killed in that manner. So I remember pitching this idea to the faculty at the University of Maryland. I said, perhaps we can use the resources in this College of Journalism, the students and faculty, to go back into the history, into the archives, and look and see whether there were other headlines in US history that sparked racist terror and massacres. What other headlines might lie hidden beneath the surface that we don't know about that caused the deaths of Black Americans? So the Kathy Best at the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism, which is a department in the College of Journalism at the University of Maryland, came to me and decided that they would try to organize this project. So the project, again, is called Printing Hate. It involved more than 60 students from the University of Maryland, University of Arkansas, 5 HBCUs. The students came from Howard University, Hampton University, Morehouse University, Morgan State University, North Carolina A&T. We also had visiting professional editors working on the project who were also descendants of enslaved Africans, which was very important to me. Those editors included Milton Coleman, who had been deputy managing editor of the Washington Post, Deborah Hurd, who had been managing editor of the style section of the Washington Post. We had Lillian Green, who's a poet and a scholar, and Ron Harris, who was an editor at the Los Angeles Times, and Diane Hawkins. So it was this huge collaboration between students, professors at the University of Maryland, visiting professors, and students at HBCUs, more than 60 students, spent several months examining the archives of newspapers and looking for any complicity that white-owned newspapers might have in inciting racist terror, massacres and lynchings. The headlines were collected in an original database, which these students designed. Telling you,
Yeah.
students are pretty incredible these days.
Can I step in really quick?
And they also designed
DeNeen, can you hear me?
audio,
Oh, the
and
Zoom, it's moving a little
they
slow.
created
Can you
they
hear me,
created a
DeNeen?
mini.
Can you
I
hear
can't
me?
hear you.
She can't? Okay.
Someone needs to
Okay,
be
can anyone
muted.
hear me? Okay, perfect. Sorry. I wanted to step in because I think we're leaning in a little bit into what folks are learning from these projects. And as you can see from what DeNeen said, a lot of them require a lot of resources and a lot of people, because from all these different projects, including Denver Urban Spectrum, there's a lot to hold. There's a lot of history that's going on, and there's a lot of complexities, a lot of different institutions. And we're also thinking about the within and the without. We're thinking about how media as its own institution has been complicit in harm with Black communities, but we're also thinking about media and journalism and its role in holding power to account. So I'm really grateful for the different ways that these projects are able to hold that. But I wanted, for folks in the room that are thinking about how can we start doing this work, what kind of ways can we start uncovering these things, if you guys could share some of, briefly, some of your biggest learnings. Particularly, we've heard a little bit of the highlights of what has been shocking and what you've found, but what you would tell other folks that are interested in starting to do this work to uncover, including the kind of coordination and maybe manpower and resource and power shifting that you had to do. And you can go ahead and start.
So it's a little hard to reflect because our project isn't complete yet, but in the course of our reporting, we found that this problem goes deeper than just the coverage of the Black Panther Party, but how traditional media was reporting on or not reporting on Black people in general. So we wanted to delve more into the systemic historical issues. One of the shortcomings of our project that I want to be transparent about, and that I think we wanted to discuss later on in the panel, was that we are a predominantly white newsroom, and the CCM reporters directly working on this project with me are also all white. I want to ensure that this project doesn't appear performative. We know that we're not able to fix racism in Golden, but we do want to uplift voices and open the conversation and be part of the conversation as it continues to evolve. And we want to make sure that we're also open to criticism. Because we're coming from a place of being a white newsroom, it's been very important for us to be aware of how that informs our coverage and to find partnerships and curate those partnerships to move the conversation in the right direction. On our project, it's been really important to work with the researchers. So we're working with Jamaica Lewis, who is the librarian at Blair Caldwell, whose presentation gave Linda this idea. She's been digging through the archives and doing historical research. We've also been working with Alan Tellis, who is a doctoral student at CU studying poli-sci. I believe he used to work at the Denver Urban Spectrum, and he's looking into laws and census data from the time.
Thank you. You know, I might suggest that we're still endeavoring to overcome in news coverage about our community, the however, nevertheless, but for, yet still syndrome. Meaning, if there is a positive story about our community, we always have to suffer from the however. So for example, when Kobe Bryant died and we had all the news coverage about all of the wonderful things that Kobe had done in his community, all of the contributions that he had made philanthropically, but then there was the, oh, however, the sex charge, which magically disappeared as soon as the check cleared. You know, these kinds of things. And MLK was a great man, however, right? He slept around on his wife, which then ultimately turned out to be a lie by the FBI. And so as we watch the Queen pass away most recently, and listening at the coverage, she all but walked on water. And we're not hearing any of the but-fors and the howevers and the yet-stills. And still there are people in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, and in African nations who would tell you a completely different story. And so if news organizations are sincere about fair and balanced and objective coverage, then we're going to have to drop all of this nevertheless so that there's always a backhanded kind of a positive coverage. And so if there's a positive story, there's always some negative angle to it in the end that kind of lingers as an asterisk about our community. And so that's one of the things that we really do need, to express about coverage, and also to stop covering things that you know is a lie. Barack Obama is a Muslim, and I'm not sure what's newsworthy about that when you know that's a lie. Trump said he discovered Juneteenth, and I'm not sure why that got coverage and traction. And so, it bothers me as a journalist to know that people in my profession would promote things and broadcast things that you know is not factual. And so I'll stop there before I get off on a speech. Okay. So.
Ariella, the same question to you. Some of your biggest learnings in coordinating and working on this project, and really any advice you would have for other folks looking to endeavor on this.
I would say that I've learned so much just about American history and about racism. I think there is just so much history that has been hidden from us and that has been just whitewashed. And it's shocking when you go back and you see just how this nation was built on slavery, built on enslavement, and built on, just a structure of racism and systematic oppression. And so that's really, it has been, I would say for me, it's been pretty eye-opening. I think in terms of how it has informed my understanding of journalism, I just think we have a lot of work to do in newsrooms around building more diverse newsrooms, building not only diverse but representative newsrooms. Like if we are in a majority Black city, if 45% of a city's population is Black, then the newsroom should be 45% Black. And it doesn't need to be a quota, but we should be representing the communities that we're covering. And I see just how much better our coverage is when we're knowledgeable about the communities that we're writing about, when we are part of the communities that we're writing about, when we're connected to those communities. And so I think just structurally newsrooms have a lot of work to do. I think that there's also just a rethinking of the traditional news pyramid and a rethinking of the way we're training people to report, because you can't really understand a given news event often without understanding this historic context of injustice. And that stuff gets cut out of stories because we're thinking about this triangle and we're thinking about, well, what happened today, what happened yesterday, but it's unfair to look at those things without understanding the context through which they grew. And so I think it's just, we really have to think again about how we're structuring it, and also not segmenting it like, oh, this is the community's desk or this is the justice project, but having this approach and having anti-racism built into all elements of the coverage, and really being able to train everyone in the newsroom to think like this and approach this. Because if there's just a couple of articles that are talking about stuff, it's a special topic, a niche topic, then we're losing, because we're not changing people's perception. And in Philadelphia, which is in the midst of a really heartbreaking gun violence crisis, I think we as a newsroom are really grappling with how to effectively cover that. And, I certainly don't have the answers. And I think my newsroom is doing a lot of work to improve how we're doing it. But when I look back at all the clips, when I edited that story about eyewitness news, you see how there's a long tail to this. And we didn't get here out of nowhere. and decades of reporting on gun violence, like it just is a random incident, has an effect on our community and how we treat things and how we fund public safety initiatives. And so I think that's my takeaway, that the project goes way beyond the boundaries of the project, and that we're losing if we're only seeing things within one project. But that you have to start somewhere, and then these projects are the training ground to change the whole way that we're producing news.
That's really insightful, and I think I hear that reflection in the first three folks that have spoke around this context that is necessary and this broader look that we need to have in order to understand Black people specifically more fully and to tell their stories more fully, including how newsrooms are structured and who gets to tell those stories. And so, DeNeen, we had an interesting conversation in our pre-show where you were talking about how you leveraged the university to think about how you could make sure that there were Black folks telling Black stories, especially when we're talking about the history that we're dealing with. So could you talk a little bit more about that experience and how you were able to ensure that it was Black freelancers, Black cartoonists, Black writers working on that project?
So again, this was a student project, but in the beginning stages when we were planning it in the spring semester of 2021, we had several conversations with professors in the college, and I said that we needed to bring in editors who were also descendants of enslaved Black people who could really understand the generational trauma that comes with these lynchings and massacres, who could bring this full comprehension of racism in America, of the racist history in America, could bring this understanding and this knowledge to students with whom they would be working. I believe very strongly that it's important that we be in the room, right? The play Hamilton says, in the room where it happens, in the room where stories are being shaped, as Ariella was saying, that we bring our knowledge of racism and racist history into the editorial meetings where these stories are shaped. And it was great that they actually listened, and they hired these visiting editors that I mentioned in my opening statement. And it was also great that they went out and hired students from historically Black colleges and universities. It was awesome that the students at the University of Maryland is predominantly white, or students who identify as white, but those students, many of them said that working on this project for that summer and that fall semester of 2021 was life-changing. Now, as you know, these students are awesome reporters, awesome writers. They will be landing in newsrooms. They'll be landing at television stations and broadcast stations and radio stations. Having this knowledge of this racist history, having worked on this project, they will bring that knowledge into these newsrooms and into these conversations. They're the next generation. They will be shaping the news. So as I was saying before, they also created a database with the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism, which allows local communities to access how their newspapers actually shaped coverage. And that database is pretty awesome. I don't know whether you guys know about, I just want to read some of these headlines so you'll know what was printed in these newspapers across the country. People have got to know what happened. So for example, there was a headline that said, Negro fiend meets his fate, fixed for barbecue, preparations to roast Jim Buchanan, Negro murderer. 3,000 will burn. That was a headline that ran in the New Orleans State in 1919. You have to know that reporters at these white-owned newspapers and editors often knew that these lynchings were going to take place. They advertised the time, date, and location of the lynchings. Reporters would go on the scene with their notebooks and write about what occurred at these lynchings as though they were covering a sporting event. The way the lynchings and massacres were covered it was so, according to our examination, became so ordinary. You'd see a story about a lynching next to a story about a budget report or a tax story or a beauty queen story. So the way these newspapers covered this racist terror that left thousands of Black Americans dead was very casual. So newspapers were complicit in the deaths of Black Americans, and we have to come to terms with that and address that and reckon with that, and hopefully shape better, that we'll be better able to shape how news coverage is presented in the future.
And DeNeen, I didn't talk to you about this before, but I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the Printing Hate Project also talked about newspapers in Colorado, and I believe KUNC followed up on a story about a lynching that was reported in Colorado, and put a young man on the front page of a newspaper that was preparing to be lynched. So that's some of the work that we did with Black Voices, is really sitting with the specifics of what was happening in Colorado, and that's a lot of what your project is working on. And I think I'm really grateful for the Denver Urban Spectrum to be on here as an intervention, and not necessarily an intervention just against white supremacy, but in building the kind of media that we need and the kind of media that we want. And so my next question is about where do we go from here? And what kind of things are you all hoping as a part of these projects, and where you're hoping they go forward? And I want to provide a little bit of context for the audience. Like I said, I work for Media 2070, which is a media reparations org, and I didn't really explain that before we started the conversation. But reparations is really about dealing with the institution of media and the harm that it is inflicted in Black communities, and thinking about what bridges are we building towards the future. And so there are like 4 pieces in the cycle of reparations that we gathered from like larger reparations movements, and one of those is acknowledging harm. So this is a big step towards how do we begin to reckon with it? How do we begin to have accountability? And how do we begin to move towards building new systems? And so I wanted to ask the panelists what you would like to see next. What would you like to see blossom from some of your work? What would the next steps be as we're holding a lot of this really painful history? How do we move forward, and what do you hope we build?
I think one of the hopes is to become a more credible news source with this project. When we state the problem, then hopefully readers will be thinking about it. If we were to just ignore our past coverage, then the conversation might never happen. We're willing to recognize that our coverage of race was problematic in the past, and even now it's lacking, and I would think we want to resolve to do better. So hopefully doing this will help us establish trust. I think the biggest piece in this is that we want to build and strengthen our community. We hope that by being aware and transparent and using this project to have conversations about race and how we cover it, we'll be able to ensure that everybody is accurately and fairly represented in our coverage. I think we also hope that other small newspapers will see our project and will examine their own coverage as a result.
You know, I really appreciate what DeNeen had to say about the revelations that her students came to throughout their project, because at the university where I am, we're having this very same problem, where many of my white students are horrified to cover anything from the minority community. And it almost becomes a cattle prod to get them to cover a Black History event or a Black Arts Festival or a Juneteenth event or MLK or anything else. And so I think what she said, really hits the nail right on the head, because particularly this generation, and I was quite shocked to see it, to learn that they were afraid to cover minority events. And I still have not gotten to the reason why, whether you think you're going to say something that gets you into hot water, whether you're going to misreport something. And the bottom line is reporting is reporting. You're simply there to tell a story and give the facts. You're not editorializing and giving your opinion about anything. So it really confused me as to why that was. I would also say, for those who are in hiring positions, to stop putting a black face on the story and thinking you've done something, because you really haven't. You've just put a black reporter in a position, and then you're still micromanaging what that coverage looks like. So you essentially, well, now, see, I didn't want to say anything like that, but yeah, okay, well, what my man said. And so, I think that if you're really interested in projecting the real story about our communities, then you will allow these young reporters that you put out here, give them their head, give them license to tell the story the right way. And so, just simply hiring an African American doesn't necessarily do the trick. I would also say that if you don't have a relationship with an HBCU and their journalism and communications department, you're really not serious about diversity in the first place, because those schools, their media programs, their student media programs are far more robust than anything that we have here in the state of Colorado. So if you take a school like Howard University, or the University of Maryland for that matter, they have TV stations that broadcast 24/7, 365. At MSU Denver, we do a weekly report, and that's the extent of our news coverage on television. And so these students are far more exposed and far more qualified, frankly, than perhaps the students who are coming out of our institution here in Colorado. And so you're missing out on some extremely fantastic talent coming out of these HBCUs. And so I would certainly recommend that you establish relationships with these schools, and I guarantee that the level of talent that you find will blow you away. And so, this would certainly be my recommendation to you, if in fact you're serious, and the jury is still out, frankly.
And I'll add on to that, since we don't have any HBCUs in Colorado, unfortunately, to go where you will find Black students as well. We heard Tia up here with Project Voice. We know where to find Black youth, or maybe you don't, and we need to start asking where those resources are, where those students are. We also have a lot of Hispanic serving institutions in Colorado. We have a lot of community colleges that are connected to indigenous students in Colorado. So we have to start asking the question, we have to start digging, and always represent those HBCUs. I love that. DeNeen and Ariella. Ariella, would you like to share where you would hope this would blossom to, or what you hope comes next?
For the Inquirer or more generally?
You could do both. You could do the Inquirer as an institution, or you could do how you hope it inspires more coverage on other institutions and generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the work that DeNeen is doing at a university level is really, really important, and like just more support for programs like that are building the next generation of journalists is really essential, and just changing the framework of the organization. And so, yeah, and I think local newsrooms, a lot of local newsrooms are really under-resourced. And so that works against diversity, because the only people that are applying for those jobs are people that don't have a lot of student debt, that might be able to rely on their parents to help them. And so you're not getting a lot of people who, might have to pay student loans or might have to do different things and aren't willing to work for, less than what they need to sustain themselves. And so I also think like newsrooms themselves have to decide to invest to build that cohort of talent.
Thank you. DeNeen.
Thank you for that. I always like to say whenever I'm at conferences like this, I always, if there are editors on stage, I actually ask them about diversity in newsrooms because I like to tell my own story. I'm from Kansas. You guys are in Colorado. I have relatives in Colorado, but I was a young student at the University of Kansas, and professor took me under her wing. By the time I was a senior, I had job offers across the country and ended up at the Washington Post that summer. And we'll often tell people, you know, eventually Ben Bradley hired me. Ben Bradley hired me. And so the Washington Post hired me right out of college and groomed me and shaped me over the years. You know, I've covered police and schools and education, and I was a foreign correspondent. I was in the style section. I was a staff writer in the Washington Post magazine. So I had a lot of opportunities. And I just want people to know that when you talk about reporters who happen to be Black, there are people who are so talented as writers. In the Post newsroom that I walked into in the 1980s was robust with talented reporters who happened to be Black. They weren't called Black reporters. They were reporters. There were reporters covering the White House. There were foreign correspondents. Gary Lee was in Russia and covering Germany. Keith Richford was covering Asia. We had Black investigative reporters. We had Black City Hall reporters that were awesome. I mean, they would go toe to toe with any reporter in the newsroom. And we often say, I mean, these reporters were just great. So if there's anybody in the session here who's in a position to hire, I want you to know that if you're looking for reporters who, happen to be Black, not just Black reporters, but happen to be Black, identify as Black, there is so much talent out there. So much talent out there. Don't stop with some of the platitudes that some newspapers give. In terms of what's happening in the future, I know that with Printing Hate, it was released at a time when a lot of newsrooms were coming to terms with their past, racial reckoning, as they called it. As a result, some newspapers actually issued apologies for their past coverage. The Kansas City Star, not as a result of Printing Hate, but the Kansas City Star apologized for its coverage. The LA Times has apologized. Orlando Sentinel. The Baltimore Sun issued this really well-written apology for decades of promoting policies that oppress Black Americans. You know, supporting slavery and segregation and silencing the voices of people in their communities. So I just hope that more newspapers might examine their histories, as the Philadelphia Inquirer is doing, confront that history, reckon with the history, and pledge to do better.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have someone on our panel today that the Golden Transcript is thinking about that. And I don't know if Corey's in the room, but Corey Hutchins and I talk a lot about who's next in Denver, who's next in Colorado. And so I just want to thank all the panelists so much for being here and for sharing about your projects. I also looked up the story I was mentioning from KUNC, and it was part of their Colorado edition, and it's called Reflecting on the Legacy of Racist Colorado Media Coverage and Correcting It Today. But I wanted to open the room up for questions, and so I'll facilitate that. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll come bring you the mic.
Thank you. DeNeen, I heard a presentation at the Investigative Reporters and Editors Conference this summer about your project. One of the aspects that I thought was mind-blowingly smart to have done was to get a computer scientist involved who did extensive coding. I'm not a coder, but what he described sounded brilliant, to do that initial electronic review of millions of pages looking for keywords. Is that code available to other papers?
Well, that professor is Sean Mussenden. You might send him an email and ask him for his code. I just know that the database is available to communities across the country. And again, that database collected hundreds of headlines that went from 1865 to 1965. I know in the spring of 2021, my students actually, they were like physically examining these headlines, looking for keywords like, the things that they would call Black people were just horrendous, like brute or fiend. So they created a database to look for these keywords and headlines. So again, maybe you can send an email to Sean Mussenden or to Kathy Best at the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism at the University of Maryland's College of Journalism. And I'm sure they would be happy to help you or talk more about that database that the professors and students designed.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? All these journalists and no questions.
Responding to Alfonzo, what you said about, what did you call it? The
However, nevertheless,
yeah,
yet
that.
still.
So, and then you took it to the Queen. And what I heard you say is that, stop doing that. Stop doing that with all the people of color that people write about, right? But like, don't we really need to do that with the Queen?
If we're going to be fair.
Right. So when people do it, and I think we're really seeing this in Great Britain right now, is people getting arrested for holding up a sign saying "Not my king" or something about colonialism, I mean, there's no doubt that many of those opinions are shared here, but they're in this sort of like context of today, present day, 2022, the like immediate police response to shut that down, and really this sort of knee-jerk, like, don't criticize here's a sacred cow, like, don't criticize the queen or the king or the monarchy. Can y'all speak to the loneliness that some people in some newsrooms feel when they're doing that and they're met with that kind of zeitgeist? Like, yeah.
I mean, and that goes specifically to the point about simply hiring a black face. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, that journalist, if had it been me, then I would have wanted to share the additional side of the story. Mm-hmm. Other than just the glorification, and not to say that the Queen does not deserve all of the accolades. I'm sure she does. But there is another side of that that's not being told, and as you so aptly point out, that when you do try to tell it, it's quickly shut down. Whereas in our community, for example, and in our coverage here in the United States, Black Lives Matter has been cast as a terrorist organization. Right. And so that when I say stop producing and broadcasting things that you know are lies and giving voice to it, that's essentially what I mean. And so, I mean, I don't object to the coverage. I don't object to the coverage, but what I do want is for it to be fair across the board. And simply putting that on a single young journalist, 24, 25 years old, to put that kind of weight on his or her shoulders, is a bit unfair. Because now they're just starting their career, they're afraid to lose their job, if in fact they speak out and say, well, wait a minute, this is not as balanced as it should be, there is another point to be made here. And so while we're lifting this person up, you know, if we're gonna air the dirty laundry of everybody else's community, then why not talk about slavery in the Caribbean and everything else that has occurred
Right.
under this leadership?
What about Urban Spectrum and Mayor Hancock?
What about it?
Do you feel that you really, dug in?
I don't think we handle our community with a kid glove. I think that if there's dirt, then we tell the dirt. But we don't tell it in a way that suggests that that's the only side of this, that there is something else to be said. For example, with the issue that we dealt with not so long ago with a young brother on the school board who had been accused of these heinous crimes, only to come to the point to where nobody would show up to suggest that they had been harmed by him. Yet his name and reputation has been utterly ruined. You know, under the same these same machinations, right? And so I think that what we've done with the mayor has been fair. I think that in this thing where there was this allegation of sexual abuse, I think we did a pretty good job of covering that and trying to shine and tell the story in a fair and objective way. Not to handle him with kid gloves, and we're not interested in handling our community with kid gloves. If we're wrong, we're wrong, and we're going to tell the community that we're wrong, right? And so even in the issue that we have on the tables here about Montbello High School, when they started to talk about breaking this school up and essentially experimenting with black students to see, well, if this works over here, then maybe we'll do it over at East. But when the suggestion was made to do the same thing at East, suddenly the conversation shut down, right? And so it's that kind of thing that we're talking about. And I think you know, obviously we're not perfect as a publication, but we do endeavor as an African American facing publication to make sure that there is some balance to what it is being promulgated in the mass media in general in the city.
With the Tay Anderson story, do you think there was a lost opportunity? I think journalists are loath to criticize other working journalists publicly, right?
Yeah.
But the Tay Anderson story, for those who are from out of town, involving this black school board member and the way he was essentially lynched in the media.
Yeah, sure.
But, you know, I think that there was a real reluctance to actually sort of have a public forum and talk about, hey, this is not just like ancient history that happened, 75 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago. This just happened last month.
Yeah.
And so how do we as an industry get over that sort of reluctance to really like call each other out publicly and have some sort of conversation that is sort of productive and progressive about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Susan, that's a tough one because we're colleagues, and we work together within this industry, and it's difficult to call each other out, in a public forum like that. But I think advancing the conversation and posing the question exactly like you just did would be a great start for us. To just say, hey, listen, we have to make sure that we get our facts right. That this was extremely biased from my vantage point in reading it. That okay, well, you simply just eviscerated this young man, in essence, trying to destroy him before he could actually get started, because somebody may be afraid that he might actually become somebody in the city. And so now let's ruin him before he gets out of the game. That's what it seemed to me to be the gist of the coverage. And so, yeah, I think we need to have those conversations and not be afraid to just hit each other between the eyes with the truth. In actuality, isn't that what we're here to do? Right?
I'm going to jump in on this
tell the truth
one.
to everybody else and then lie to each other.
I'm going to jump in on this one because I also have my own 2 cents about the coverage. And I think that it's multifaceted. And when we're talking about who's in the newsrooms and what perspectives we're telling the stories from. So if we're talking about the Queen, if we had people from the islands that have been colonized and been ruined by the empire, we might have had a different perspective on how those stories came out. If we're thinking about the Tay Anderson situation, if we had more voices from folks that are survivors of sexual assault, we might have had a different conversation that was more nuanced. If we had more Black people that understand the history of posing Black men as threats in that way, it might have been a more nuanced conversation. But this question of how do we hold each other to account, I think that's a larger question in journalism. And I think that it's a question that a lot of us are holding in society about what do we do when harm happens? And how do we come with the intentions of moving forward rather than just to attack one another? And I think that that is what we're trying to hold here. So it's not just a question of journalism. It's a question of how do we deal with harm better? And that's some of what the reparative work that I'm doing is on. So I'll have answers hopefully someday, soon for folks. But we have about 1 minute left, so I'm gonna give you the last question. And then I think our room host is gonna come make some announcements for us.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Quan Atlas. I started the 5 Points Atlas local newspaper in 5 Points. I just wanted to push back on a little bit of the conversation and just kind of put it in there. I think that, you know, with respect to the talk about tokenism, I think that that's like, I just wanted to be clear, hire Black people. And yes, give them the responsibility and give them that space. I think when we talk about Black people, we talk about tokenism. I think it's interpreted as now a barrier for white organizations to take that step. And then even when we talk about, lady said, it doesn't have to be a quota. When we had quotas, like that was the period in which Black people made so many strides. They became the first. They were integrated, forced into industries that they were locked out of. And yes, I'm sure there's pain and there's problems, and we have to, as a professor told me one time, you know, we have to step in it. So don't be afraid to do the things structurally that are going to make a difference in the long run, just because, you know, people's feelings are going to get hurt. And things are not going to be pretty, but hire that Black person, or your next role, you say like, it's going to be a Black person. It's going, like, we're going to address it. We're going to have that quota. If you don't, you know, if you're afraid of tokenizing, I think that's just going to be, have that relationship and understand what that person likes and how they feel and what they would like to do, and build that relationship. And that way you can reduce the harm that may be caused, but harm is going to happen. And I think step into that. And I want to push back on the narrative about Black publications and what we may or may not do. I personally, I'm private owned. I don't care if people think about our publication and what we're not doing. I created it to be a positive representation of the community that I care about, and that's what it's going to be. I have the power to make that decision. So that's what I'm going to do. You have the power within your organizations to do what you want to do, and you have to deal with the harm that you may cause, but you have to be intentional and just move forward with that. So I just wanted to push back on that. If you can only hire one, just do it. But maybe hire two, then it's not really so tokenizing.
I made the comment about no quotas, and I wasn't to suggest that you're not hiring Black people or people of color. I was just making a point that I had said that we should have 40% Black people in our newsroom because the city of Philadelphia is 40% Black. And then I was saying, well, it doesn't need to be exact point for point. But I mean, yeah, I think the larger point is that newsrooms do need to have structural change in order to make the newsrooms more diverse, because we've had de facto quotas in the other way, where it's been de facto accepted that people recruit from white communities and white-led institutions, and there's been kind of built-in bias in the opposite way. So I absolutely agree with you, and didn't mean to suggest that we should shy away from hiring people.
I'm glad you made that point, because I think it just speaks to a lot of what we've been hearing today about there's individual work to be done, there's individual locales that have work to do, individual newsrooms, individual newsroom leaders, but there's also a broader structure that is working with all of this. And so I'm grateful that we have people from all over. We have people from Philly, we have people from Maryland, we have people from Colorado represented, and there's a lot of great journalists, great people working on how do we move together to kind of think at these bigger problems. So how are we hiring Black folks, but also thinking about the broader structure of a newsroom that makes them feel safe and makes them feel like they can do the work that they came into the field to do. But I just want to thank everyone here so much for sharing all your wisdom on your projects and holding all the work that you do in really uncovering history and doing the role that we spoke about in the keynote of journalism as educators and really sharing that information with all of us. So I think that's it. I don't know where our room host went, but I'm gonna wrap it up for everyone here. Feel free to stay around and talk and get information from folks. But thank you for joining us today. And if you have any questions, I'll be up here.